The reason I'm sharing this is for the world and the American people to hear what is going on behind the doors of ICE and to fight for those who are still in custody.
Witness Radio.
This time last year, agents of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, ICE, accelerated the removal of African asylum seekers to the U.S. in a series of monthly mass deportation flights, starting in August 2020 and continuing through January 2021. Many of the deported individuals had been locked up in ICE prisons for years. Some still had pending asylum cases. All feared being sent back to the violent circumstances they fled. ICE called in its special team, also referred to as the ICE military by many of the former detainees I interviewed. This team, armed and dressed in military garb, used brutal measures, pepper spray, chokeholds, rubber bullets, beatings, and other forms of violence to force signatures and fingerprints onto travel documents needed to deport Cameroonian, Congolese, and other African refugees. A nationwide legal and advocacy movement rose up. Complaints against ICE and its tactics flooded the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, highlighting the agency's myriad human rights abuses. Lobbying efforts urged members of Congress to halt the unnecessary and unnecessarily cruel deportations back to harm, paid for by the U.S. taxpayer. Attorneys worked round the clock for months on end to win the releases of clients held in ICE detention indefinitely, without explanation, even during a deadly pandemic that ripped through ICE facilities. Advocates fought on behalf of those for whom securing legal counsel while in ICE prisons proved impossible or predatory. But the abuses and the flights continued. In October 2020, ICE ferried 57 asylum seekers back to Cameroon on Omni Air International. In November, another not quite 24 Cameroonians were expelled on the same chartered airlines, meaning the U.S. government, through its agency actors and paid contractors, went to extraordinary lengths to deport about 80 people to a country racked by protracted violence. Armed conflict with Boko Haram in the north, as well as increasingly escalating persecution of the minority Anglophone population in the country's northwest and southwest regions, have left thousands of Cameroonians dead, over 1 million internally displaced, and 4.4 million in need of humanitarian assistance. As of this recording, over 67,000 Cameroonians have fled their homeland, running from extrajudicial killings, civilian massacres, arbitrary arrests, and torture. Cameroon is one of the world's greatest humanitarian crises. It is also one of the most globally ignored. Despite the violence there, much of it state-sponsored, the U.S. continues to deny Cameroonians the promise it projects out to the world, that we are a safe haven and a beacon of hope. Instead, it is U.S. government policy to criminalize these asylum seekers, to detain them under the harsh hand of ICE for years, to withhold from them due process under the law, then to return them back to harm, in violation of the principle of non-refoulement through deportation tactics that are tantamount to torture. One such tactic is the use and abuse of a Federal Drug Administration registered medical device and human restraint called the RAP. A new civil rights complaint, filed on October 13, 2021, by 7 immigrants' rights organizations, details ICE's routine use of the RAP to threaten, coerce, and punish people who protest their deportations, out of fear of being returned to the violent country conditions they fled. The RAP is designed to bind and immobilize the legs. Used per the manufacturer's guidelines, it leaves its victims seated in an upright 90-degree position, so their lungs and airways are not compromised. But ICE agents apply the RAP on people already restrained in 5-point shackles, Then they cinch the wrapped up until their torsos are at a 45 to 60 degree angle with their legs, leaving them shrieking in pain, in some cases for hours. This is considered a stress position by the Convention Against Torture. It is a serious human rights violation under international law. ICE thought it could whisk any evidence of these crimes away on planes flown by Omni Air International, never to be heard from again. But that stops now. In this podcast episode, 3 brave men, all parties to the rap complaint, come forward to disclose the abuses they endured under agents of ICE enforcement and removal operations before and during deportation proceedings on Omni Air International on October 13th and November 11th, 2020. We'll start with the man we call Ray. As in the complaint, filed on the 1-year anniversary of the first ICE Air flight to carry them back to harm, all the men you will hear from today are identified by pseudonyms for their protection.
In my country, when I organized with some teacher.
In my country, I organized with some teachers a protest march, a march about marginalization and discrimination and so many killings caused by the military. I was taken to the police station. I was beaten there at my feet with a machete for so many hours. When I was released, I had so much pain. I didn't have justice in my country. I was afraid for my life. That's why I needed to flee to the USA to get freedom. I crossed so many countries. When I reached the USA, ICE treated us like animals, like you are not a human being. Me, I was running for my life, and I came to ask for protection in the US. When I reached detention, I told them about my foot pain. They didn't care. They never gave me ibuprofen. They gave me some strong medicine that made me feel better for a few days. Then the pain would restart. Also, when I was in detention, I got COVID-19. 2 years and 10 months I did in detention. My judge, when I was in Florida Detention Center, was not taking importance to look at my case. At the bad situation that I left before in my country, I was so afraid because I did not have a lawyer. I presented myself. I did not want to go back to my country, and I tried to refuse to go into the deportation plane. They just threw me onto the ground until my back was on the floor. They put the wrap on me. They had it there already, and they just tied up my whole body until my knees were closed up with my mouth. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't breathe. I told an officer that I couldn't breathe. When I told him that I couldn't breathe, he told me that he didn't care, that I need to stay calm. The pain that I had in my feet started to feel bad, and I just cried. I just cried there. And when they did it, when they wrapped me, they wanted just to show to the people behind me, don't try to refuse. Because when the people came out straight ahead before the airplane, they saw me. I was on the ground. I was on the ground, and ICE left me there until all others were inside the plane. I was crying, that I was feeling terrible. I told them that, but they just left me in that position until one officer came and told me that if they remove the wrap, I must stay quiet or they will put it on again. When they removed the wrap, I had a lot of difficulty walking. Two officers just carried me onto the plane. I'm just disappointed about that decision that the US took to send us back to Cameroon. So many of us were arrested at the airport. Some left Cameroon already. Some people that were arrested at the airport, I don't know if they are alive right now or if they are still in prison. Since I was sent back to Cameroon, I just hide. When I left my country, when I fled, I thought that the USA was a country that could protect us. I thought that the US was a country where we can have justice, real justice. I thought that the USA was a country where we can be free, where we can explain ourselves about the treatment that we were subjected to in our country. I am not a criminal. I just went there to seek asylum. The US government knows about the situation in my country. They know that they sent us back to die.
In my country, they know that they sent us back to die.
They sent us back to die, says Ray. That is why attorneys and advocates have dubbed OmniAir International the death plane. As Ray stated, many on the flights were detained upon arrival in Douala, Cameroon. Some have never been heard from again. All had their passports and national ID cards confiscated by ICE, who turned them over to officials of the government of Paul Biya, now 88 years old. Biya has ruled Cameroon with an increasingly iron fist since November 6, 1982. That's 39 years in the presidential palace. Fearing arrest if they ever enter police headquarters to request their documents, most of our brothers and sisters returned on the death plane are now living in hiding, like Ray, unable to enjoy freedom of movement. Others, like Castillo, who was on the November flight, had to flee Cameroon again, through the jungle and under cover of night. After his family managed to raise enough funds to bribe prison officials to allow him to escape from one of Cameroon's notoriously medieval prisons.
Yeah, good evening to everyone in the house. Yeah, I'm Castillo, sharing my experience about the November deportation flight to Cameroon. Early that morning, two officers came to our dorm in Pearland, Dallas, Texas. They asked us to pack our belongings. I demanded that I need to speak to an ICE officer to know my situation because they cannot just come in the morning and ask me to pack. I don't know where I'm heading to. So I demanded that I need an ICE officer so that you can answer my questions. So the two officers, they left. 5 minutes later, they came. They called me, they told me, young man, come, we have discussed with ICE and we found out that you will not be deported. That follow us, carry your things and follow us. I took my belongings and followed them. Instead, they were lying to me. They took me into isolation in a cell. They locked me up. Some minutes later, a nurse came to check over me if I was okay. I told the nurse that I'm okay, but my only worry is where they want to carry me to. So the nurse left. Then, few minutes later again, a group of ICE special team is written on their uniform. They're always in charge of deportation came, carrying guns, putting on military uniforms with black tinted eyeglasses. They came to the cell that I was in. They opened the door and immediately start firing bullets at me. Though they were rubber bullets. I received 2 shots on my right thigh and 2 shots on my left shin. They fell on me and took me out of the cell and threw me on the floor inside the hall. They fell on me and I was facing the ground. They held my hands. Either of them hold my hands. Some of them were holding my legs. I was shackled at 5-point restraint. I couldn't help myself. I couldn't fight anymore. I couldn't resist. So they shouted, bring the wrap. They brought the wrap and I was put inside the wrap after being shackled at 5-point restraint. I was carried by 4 of those ICE special men to the bus in Pearland. From there, I was transported to the airport in Dallas.
The airport Castillo refers to here is called Alliance Field. It is located in the outskirts of the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area and is used primarily by cargo operators like FedEx. The charter airlines, Omni Air International, is the only private operator willing to fly long-haul mass deportation flights for the Department of Homeland Security. When not expelling asylum seekers, Omni is a Department of Defense troop mover. It is paid handsomely to operate ICE removal flights. And here's a surprising connection. Omni's parent, Air Transport Services Group, is a publicly traded company whose biggest shareholder, owning 19.5% and an option to double that stake, is Amazon.com.
While at the airport, I pleaded several times with these ICE officers, that please, I want to use the restroom. But none of them answered my call. None of them tried to help. I was in pain, in deep pain, with the shackles, even with the rope leaving from my neck, my chest level down to my legs, keeping me at an angle of 40 to 60 degrees. I was totally immobile. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't help myself. I was crying. We waited at the airport for a very long time before the plane took off.
One of the reasons for the extended wait was that another man subjected to the rap that day, Ernest, had to be removed from the scene. This was ICE's second attempt to deport Ernest to Cameroon. Both times he was wrapped. Both times he was also hooded. In October, ICE pulled him off the plane. We're not sure why. But in November 2020, he was back, slated for deportation to Cameroon again. When, wrapped and hooded a second time, he experienced excruciating chest pain, ICE pulled him off that plane as well. Upon reviving him in an ambulance, ICE sent Ernest straight back to detention. There is no indication that Ernest was ever provided appropriate medical care after that incident. Now, back to Castillo.
They carried me from the bus to the plane, the same special team ICE officers. I was in the plane, I had to sit on 3 seats because when you are being put in a wrap, you can't bend your knees, you can't do anything. So your legs have to be straight. So I had to sit on 3 seats. While in the plane, midway the Atlantic Ocean, I was crying. Even everyone in the flight was shouting at the officers that they should please pity my situation and let me use the restroom. So they took off the wrap. I went and used the restroom while still at 5-point restraint. All over the whole flight, I didn't eat anything. The last time I ate was the eve of the deportation. So when we got to Cameroon, I was arrested at the airport and taken and detained. I was detained for 12 days under horrible conditions, no food, no bed, no mattress, no mat, no water to drink. It was a very difficult time for me, even the experience I had while in custody and during my deportation. I still echo the sound of the gunshots, the bullets, everything. It has been a difficult time for me and my family. Right now, I'm hiding in a third country, still fighting to get to safety. The reason I'm sharing this is for the world and the American people to hear what is going on behind the doors of ICE and to fight for those who are still in custody. It has been a difficult time for me, very traumatizing time. So I rest my case.
A third man wrapped by ICE that day is a nurse by vocation, a choral director by avocation, and a person of deep religious faith who wants to be known as God's will. He has 4 siblings living in the U.S., among them 3 naturalized U.S. citizens. Now they are shouldering $30,000 of debt in legal fees, spent in hopes of obtaining God's will's release from detention. They were all waiting eagerly to share the responsibility of sponsoring him throughout the adjudication of his asylum claim. Not only would God's will never have posed a burden on the U.S. taxpayer, but his skills and expertise in nursing might have been an asset to our country in its battle against the coronavirus. Instead, like Castillo, God's will is now hiding in a third country. This is his story.
When we were leaving the detention center, the Peruvian detention center, we're all in chains. I was chained on my legs, my waist, and my hands. So as the vehicle arrived at the airport, we're all called out by names to come and you follow the file. When my name was called, I had to go out and the ICE officers, they were already lined up, like from the vehicle right up to the stairs of the plane. And so when you come out, they'll touch you if you carry anything on. And they also check your cuffs if they are all in place. Just to say, before we left the detention center, I had not eaten for 2 days. And not eating for 2 days, the food was not really the best. And given all the trauma I was going through, I had no appetite. I couldn't eat. With all the trauma, with all the pain, with all the torture I had gone through, and looking that I'm going back into the lion's den, going back into where I was been running from. So I was drained out. I was weak. So as I arrived at the stairs of the plane, as I tried to step up onto the plane, I tripped and I fell. As I tripped and I fell, I can't say how many, but it's like they were just waiting for it. A lot of ICE officers dressed in military uniform, they came on me. I don't know, like 10 or what number, I cannot really say. But I just had a lot of persons holding me, lifting me up. Now I wasn't resisting. I wasn't fighting back. They carried me up and they just went and placed me on the ground on a rack. And they were tying me. I discovered my legs were being tied. Then I was crying and asking, what are they doing to me? But nobody was responding. I just stayed there like a log of wood. They were just tossing me around in whatever direction that they wanted me to be. They were just moving me around, tying me up, tying my legs. As they tied my legs, they brought another part of the wrap. They put on my upper body. They tied my upper body, my hands under the wrap. Then we had to now link my upper body into my lower body. They linked my head. It's like I had persons leaning on my back, pressing my back. Let me not say they were pressing my back, pushing my back down towards like bringing my head to my feet. My feet were stretched out, tied in a wrap, and they were pushing my head, bringing my head down into my legs. So as I was crying and wailing to hear what are you doing? That they are killing me. Nobody was saying anything. Just like their procedures that do this. Nobody even asked me why I felt. I didn't resist any person. But immediately as I fell, they just picked me up on the wrap and they tied me up. And they now helped me now from both sides. They helped me. It's like they were carrying a log of food, like you're carrying a coffin. 3 persons on this side, 3 persons on this side. And they carried me and they were just passing me up into the plane, and they went and dumped me up right up into the middle seats of the plane. I was crying, I was begging. I told them that if they had to suffer me like this, if they had to send me back, it's better they killed me. I told them that I know they have guns on them. It's better they kill me than for them to send me back to where I'm going to. Nobody cared about what I was saying. I cried to them. I told them that I'm in pains, that I am suffering from waist and back pain, that I am suffering from asthma. I told them that I couldn't breathe. I was crying that I couldn't breathe. The cuffs, since they had to put the wrap above the cuffs now were eating into my flesh. I cried to them that I'm asthmatic. The doctor that was on board, he came. I told him that I can't breathe. I was gasping for air, that I can't breathe, that I needed my inhaler in my jacket. He set his hand in my jacket and he he put it in my mouth and gave me 2 puffs of it. As I was crying with pain, one officer came. Instead of him to try to relieve me, instead for him to try to relax my upper body a bit, he instead fastened. He came and he was fastening the belt, dragging my head down towards my leg. I don't understand why they had to treat me like that. I don't know why they had to treat me like that. But I was crying and wailing to them that it's better they kill me than to put me all through this torture. I was still on the wrap when they were already airborne. That was when I pleaded that I had to go to the restroom. They came and released the lower part of the wrap so that I could walk, but the cuffs were still on. The cuffs on my legs were still on. I had to walk to the bathroom. My upper arms were still tied under the wrap. It was difficult, so I had to just saw myself trying to urinate. Before they even relieved me, they came and asked me if I'm going to cause a scene. I didn't resist anybody while I'm trying, so I'm not going to cause any scene. They came and now released me of the wrap. So that's what happened to me before and after the wrap. Right up to now, I'm still suffering from pain on my waist and back pain. I can't sit for long. I can't even sleep. I sleep and I'm moving around, trying to look for a good position so that I could sleep. No person should ever be treated in this way again. That nobody should ever go through this pain, this torture that I went through. You're sending me back to a place that the whole world knows that is going through political crisis, that persons are being killed every day, torturing me while they're sending me back. The head of the Homeland of Security, you are the boss, you know what we are going through back in Cameroon. But what I went through, what I have gone through, it shouldn't happen to any other person again.
That is the wish of all 5 parties to the rap complaint: Ray, Castillo, Ernest, Godswill, and Sam, who was rapped during ICE's attempt to deport him in September 2020. And who witnessed several others being rapped at that time as well, at the Alexandria staging facility in Louisiana, as well as from detention in Florence, Arizona. Sam was the first asylum seeker to ever speak to me about the rap. He didn't know what it was called then. He told me simply that he'd been stuffed into a sack. When I pressed him for details, he said he was bagged and tied. He was traumatized by the experience, as were his doormates, who witnessed a force of 8 to 10 ICE military knock Sam down, pin him to the ground, shackle him, wrap him, and drag him from the Texas detention facility where he was then being warehoused. He was bussed while in the wrap to the nearest airport, 2 to 3 hours away. Following the October and November flights, I began to hear similar language from advocates and attorneys with whom I'm in contact. Ray says he was bagged. Castillo was bagged and tied. Ernest was bagged and hooded. Godswill said he was stuffed into a sack and folded like a tortilla, then carried onto the plane like you would carry a coffin or a load of wood. I determined to uncover what was meant by these descriptions. Over the course of the next several months, I tracked down and interviewed more than 3 dozen individuals deported back to harm in Cameroon on the October and November Omni Air death planes. Through their testimonies, I was able to identify the rap. When I showed them a picture, they all confirmed that was the bag they were tied up in. In a phone conversation with Charles Hammond, CEO of the rap manufacturer Safe Restraints, I learned that ICE is Safe Restraints' biggest customer. In an email exchange with ICE spokesperson Mary Houtman, I was able to confirm that the rap is authorized for use by the agency, but only while in flight. I shared my findings of seeming routine abuse of the rap by ICE agents with Professor Fatma E. Marouf, director of the Immigrant Rights Clinic at Texas A&M University Law School. She agreed to provide representation in the case. I'm going to pass the mic to Professor Marouf to give you a sense of the complaint and where we filed it, what we expect, and why. Thanks.
Thank you. I want to thank our complainants for their testimony today. They're all doing this despite the great risk to their own safety, and you can imagine the amount of courage it takes to come forward and share these stories with the general public. The complaint was filed with an internal watchdog office within DHS, actually 2 offices. One is the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, which is often called CRCL, and the other is with the Office of the Inspector General, or OIG, which has an Office of Investigations. And these 2 agencies work very closely together. Often what CRCL can do is make a recommendation for OIG to investigate. So what we're really hoping will be the next step is that once they get the complaint, they will decide that this is a situation that warrants investigation and that they will start that process. The complaint alleges several deviations from ICE's own detention standards, as well as various federal and state laws. and from the manufacturer's own guidance on how the wrap should be used. The wrap is actually an FDA authorized medical device, but the way it's supposed to be used is not the way ICE is using it. So just to mention a few of the critical differences, ICE has modified the device in different ways. For example, one of the individuals whose stories is mentioned in the complaint by the pseudonym Ernest was subjected to hooding. So a hood was placed over his head with netting over his face. Both times the wrap was applied to him. People are supposed to be restrained at a 90-degree angle so that their legs are basically perpendicular to their torso. Instead, they're being hunched over, which is why the wrap is often called a tortilla. People are basically folded in half. People are left alone in the wrap. I think Castillo mentioned he was sitting across 3 seats on an airplane. I can't imagine how he would possibly be buckled in or safe in that position. And he's left there on a row of the plane by himself with no one directly supervising him. Godswill has asthma, and so even individuals with severe medical conditions are placed in this wrap without a doctor being always present with them, without even making sure if it's safe for them to be placed in the wrap beforehand. And the wrap is only supposed to be used on board flights. But in every case that we've documented, the wrap was applied before the flight, in some cases, hours before the flight. For example, Castillo was placed in the wrap at Prairieland Detention Center, transferred in the wrap on a bus ride to the airport, and then left in the wrap, not just until he was boarded onto the plane, but until he was halfway over the Atlantic Ocean. So these are huge deviations.
And that is all on top of the fact that all deportees are deported in chains. In the case of these asylum seekers, it was 5-point, which is hand shackled to a waist chain, also connected to ankle shackles. And the flight to Douala took 16 hours. Shortly after filing the wrap complaint, Professor Maroof heard from an attorney representing a group of Somalis who were subjected to some kind of additional restraint device in 2017. After reading our complaint, she is convinced that it was the wrap that was applied over 5-point shackles. Her clients have since joined our complaint. Their death plane was not allowed to land. It was forced to return to the U.S. All told, these individuals were shackled for 48 hours.
There's one other legal precedent case that I found that talks about, the wrap specifically. And it's a case involving a private school for boys. And some of the key issues there that led the judge in that case, the federal district court judge, to find that the use of the wrap amounted to torture are some of the same issues that we see here. One is that the boys had physical and mental health conditions that weren't taken into account. That's exactly what's happening here. And 2 is they were left in the wrap for hours, which is not how the wrap is supposed to be used. We see that happening here, sometimes for many, many hours. So these raise very serious legal concerns. Some of the claims we have brought are under the United Nations Convention Against Torture, under the Rehabilitation Act, which protects people with disabilities and programs that receive federal funding, under state criminal and tort laws, as well as under federal civil rights laws, criminal laws that pertain to discrimination based on race and civil rights violations related to that. We believe these are very serious allegations, and we hope that they will be investigated.
I think it might be worth telling everyone how often complaints filed with DHS-CRCL actually get any kind of response, much less remedy.
Yeah, unfortunately, the response rate is not great. However, we still feel like this is an important step to take. So it both brings these issues to the agency's attention, allowing a closer internal review of what's happening. And it gives us a chance to try to get more facts about what's happening as well. Because most people who are deported are never heard from again, there's unfortunately not a good way to gather data about who has been subjected to the restraint. But it's definitely not only this detention center, or only this flight, because as Sarah mentioned, once this complaint was filed and people found out about it, there's at least one other, the flight to Somalia, the 2017 sort of hell flight to Somalia that had to turn around and come back to the United States because it couldn't land. We know that people on that flight were subjected to the wrap. That flight left out of Florida. It's also not just used on long haul flights. For example, we've seen it being used on buses. We've seen it being used temporarily before people are put on flights. Like Ray was wrapped at the Alexandria, Louisiana airport, where ICE has a temporary staging area / holding cell. From the reports we have, the wraps are laid out at the airport before buses come for deportation as sort of a warning sign that we're seeing in the overhead compartment. So ICE has them and ICE is using them. We have no reason to believe this practice has stopped. At this point, we're basically saying we think that the way the RAP is being used is unlawful, and we're asking for the complainants to be granted humanitarian parole so that they can return to the US to participate fully in an investigation. Do I think this is enough? Probably not, but it is the first step. Usually, before you file a lawsuit in a court of law, it's actually required that you exhaust administrative remedies, meaning you first seek relief at the agency level. We should really go through this process before contemplating a lawsuit. And I'm actually hoping, with the severity of these allegations, an investigation will be started in this case. Unfortunately, our immigration law provides for mandatory detention of asylum seekers who come up to the port of entry and legally exercise their right to request asylum. So that is, a huge part of the law that I think needs to be changed. It's very hard for asylum seekers to get out of detention. It's easier for someone who crosses unlawfully to not be detained than for somebody who legally presents themselves at the border and asks for asylum and are taken therefore into mandatory detention. So we have a system that really does penalize people for seeking asylum.
The RAP complaint was filed on October 13th, 2021 by Professor Maroof and her clinic at Texas A&M. We received news 10 days later, on October 23rd, that DHS is taking the RAP complaint seriously. Interviews with complainants took place on October 27th. The OIG, Office of Inspector General, is now considering whether it will mount a full-blown investigation. This is huge, for while these actions are exactly what the DHS Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties is set up to do, 98% of complaints filed during the Trump administration went unanswered. Sadly, such negligence did not begin with him. According to data published by the American Immigration Council in 2017, the agency took no action in 95.9% of complaints filed between 2012 and 2015. The RAP complaint enjoys the support of 6 co-signing organizations: African Communities Together, the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, the Haitian Bridge Alliance, the UndocuBlack Network, Witness at the Border, and the Cameroon Advocacy Network, which is also leading the charge to obtain Temporary Protected Status, or TPS, and Deferred Enforcement of Deportation, DED, for the 40,000 Cameroonians right now living in the United States. Coinciding with the filing of the RAP complaint, Representative Zoe Lofgren, Democrat of California, introduced legislation urging Congress to designate TPS for U.S.-based Cameroonians. She is supported in this effort by Representative Karen Bass and Senator Chris Van Hollen, among other members of Congress. Now we need you. Please contact your senators and House representative. Urge them to support TPS and DED for Cameroon. Send them the RAP complaint to show them why all Black immigrants are at risk under ICE. You'll find the link to the complaint in the show notes below. Although TPS is not perfect, it's a good start to make sure that Cameroonians currently in the United States aren't just swept up in the ICE dragnet and deported, for mass deportations of Black migrants has not stopped. Since the inauguration of President Biden, there has been an almost 33% increase above the pace of deportations in the fall of 2020. That's according to ICE Air Tracker Thomas Cartwright of Witness at the Border.
Can we all please lend our support and our gratitude to Godswill and Castillo and Ray for coming forward despite the odds, despite the danger, to make sure that this apparatus is never used on anybody again? Can we have big shout out of gratitude in your space for our 6 migrant rights organizations who are co-signatories to our complaint? And to you, big gratitude for coming and joining the fight and the movement to repeal policies based on cruelty and begin to welcome with dignity, because one thing we can all agree on, and that is cruelty is not okay. It just isn't.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks and gratitude to Witness Radio executive producer, Professor Camilo Perez Bustillo, our Patreon patrons, without whom we could not produce this show, and to you, our listeners. I'm Sarah Towell, host and director of Witness Radio. where we aim to discuss all the issues plaguing the U.S. immigration system today. This is Why We Witness. Subscribe, rate, and review Witness Radio on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. And please consider becoming a patron of Witness Radio if you haven't already. Just go to patreon.com/witnessradio and sign up. We'll see you here, there, and everywhere. Witness Radio is produced by Livia Brock.